organizing what I think is a really timely and necessary discussion about Boko Haram and the troubles that persist in the Lake Chad Basin area. As my colleague has said, we've already covered a lot of ground in terms of policy analysis and what's going on in the region. I'll just talk a little bit about definitions and response, and hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and answers. Generally thinking about how we respond or how we have responded to the phenomenon that is Boko Haram, we start from the premise that we understand what it is, and we generally think counterterrorism. That sends specific signals, whether thinking about a military response, political response, or an economic response. It is not just it is not just terrorism. The root causes of Boko Haram and the reason why it has gone from where it was in 2002 to where it is today is because the root causes are a lot broader than terrorism writ large. They're a lot deeper than socioeconomic discontent, and they're a lot more complex than the politicization of religion. And those three things are all interrelated. So if we take as a point of departure a need to understand this phenomenon a lot better, we then think if we get the diagnosis right, then what is the approach? What's the required approach? How do we ensure that it receives the attention it demands? How do we ensure that the resources are available? And how do we ensure that it is coordinated? One of the things that Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield mentioned is the importance of sequencing. Last December, President Buhari said, technically, Boko Haram has been defeated. What he was actually referring to was the fact that when he took office, Boko Haram held territory in about 65 local government areas in northern Nigeria. And by end December, they only held territory in less than 5. So technically, he thought they had been defeated, but they have not, because the underlying reasons why it arose and spread has still not been addressed. And that's why we're seeing not just an intensification of the brutality of Boko Haram, we're seeing new Boko Harams rising every day in northern Nigeria. So my point of departure is that even if we were to address Boko Haram sufficiently, there are other groups that could be a lot more regional, some potentially global, and would cause us a lot of distress. A colleague of mine has, distilled a possible toolkit down to 3 Ds. In academia, we try to make things easy to remember. The first he calls decapitation. That is when we send the military in to go take out the leaders and their command and control assets. The military has been trying to do this. The multinational joint task force has been trying to do this for a while with some success. The second D is disengagement. That's where you try to address the political and the politicization of Islam component of this scourge we have in northeastern Nigeria. And the third is de-radicalization. That's something that appears in a lot of policy documents, but most people have not unpacked it sufficiently. Because if we're going to get at the youth dynamic, if we're going to get at the unemployment dynamic, if we're going to get at the disaffectation dynamic, we have to address de-radicalization. That is when we will starve groups like Boko Haram of the foot soldiers they need to perpetrate the sort of crimes that Congresswoman Wilson was sharing with us. Why has this been so difficult to do in Nigeria and in the Lake Chad Basin? I think that if we haven't really, not just diagnosed, but we haven't really thought through how to put the three Ds together in a way that makes sense in a lasting manner. In closing, I'll just reference the Plan Colombia. Plan Colombia is not easily transferable to Nigeria or the Lake Chad Basin, but there are four things about Plan Colombia that I think are relevant here. The first is the importance of leadership. The leadership in Colombia was resolute that something had to be done, not just about decapitating the FARC, but by prioritizing the civilians and ensuring that once you've secured a military victory in an area, you follow up closely with law enforcement and socioeconomic assistance. The second is the long-term dynamic. It took Plan Colombia about 8 to 10 years to really begin to turn the corner in a manner that's sustainable. The third is they had really, really good interagency collaboration, not just in terms of the military doing what it does and telling the others, but involving them, integrating them. Law enforcement and the military work together really closely. In the Lake Chad Basin, it needs to start in Nigeria. We need to have a semblance of Plan Colombia that would not just focus on decapitating one group, Boko Haram, but addressing the underlying causes that allowed not just Boko Haram to emerge and proliferate, but now we're seeing other groups beginning to join. Thank you.
Yes. First, I'd like to extend my appreciations to the hardworking Congresswoman Karen Bass, and then also Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, who gave a very passionate speech that I haven't quite heard in a while with the graphics, which drives the point home. So apparently we are in the right place to begin to formulate a renewed engagement on this Boko Haram madness. I like to liken Boko Haram as a group that's really not from this world. Where they are from is probably still yet to be fathomed, but the atrocities that Boko Haram has committed are actually so vast and so devastating that what we see here in the filtered information that sometimes comes out, it's really a tip of the iceberg, especially for those of us in the Nigerian American diaspora and the West African diaspora who face a substantial brunt of direct hits, even when we are not in West Africa physically, but here in the United States. I'm going to speak a little bit on three issues: the impact of this whole matter on the diaspora community, and then also the roles the diaspora community has taken on so far to contain the situation, and then also the rising menace of other groups which are not too far off from Boko Haram. Well, first, the impact on the diaspora has been direct because pretty much everyone from West Africa who has roots in West Africa has some knowledge or contacts or relatives who have at one time or the other been impacted by Boko Haram, even though Boko Haram is based in northeast Nigeria. But because of the mobility of the Nigerian continent, you find that of the Nigerian country, you find that people move, and the people who in northeast of Nigeria may actually have roots in other parts of Nigeria, such as the south, the southeast or the southwest. And so when Boko Haram first started, the initial targets were those who did not have roots in that particular region and who were also not Muslim. But eventually, it took a whole different dimension where everybody was, pretty much a target, down to children, women, babies. And so what we're seeing here, it's a kind of a horror movie that is being replayed over and over, because obviously Boko Haram has not been contained. And so the fact that the diaspora, may live and work and send remittances from the United States, but the impact on them, it's two or threefold, because first, once the political situation begins to change with hardship, then the economic situation changes as well. And so for folks who used to do an occasional transfer of funds or resources to help out persons who are in need in Nigeria, now find that all of a sudden those people don't have any other means of livelihood. And given the challenges the Nigerian government has had for some time now, anytime there's a problem in Nigeria, then the burden of supporting ordinary Nigerians begins to shift to the diaspora community. And these are burdens that cannot be ignored, because they can be literally life and death issues. Medicines at a minimum, even food, sometimes resources to purchase food becomes issues that the diaspora now has to deal with. And a lot of the aid that is going from the diaspora, even though it's informal, but it has actually picked up from when the United States and other countries used to do a more structured aid to the continent. Most people in the diaspora are essentially mini ambassadors of the United States when they travel, because they bring goodwill, they bring a little bit of change, and you find that they don't whatever goodwill that they bring also affects the way the population views the United States. And so engaging with them as they engage back with their home countries becomes something that may be paramount, because it becomes a hybrid way of evaluating things that are happening in Nigeria and in West Africa and some of the other countries in Africa that face all these problems. And then, of course, we know that the U.S. diplomats do a tremendous job when they go overseas amid all the challenges. And so but we also find that there are limitations in what diplomats can do when they go to places like Nigeria, because they have to tread softly in engaging with the locals, whereas the diasporans can actually say it as is. And the Nigerian other governments in the region have this issue where they're hesitant to engage with the diaspora, because they cannot intimidate the diaspora the same way they would intimidate the locals. And also the diaspora bring resources. And so it's probably a great idea that when the State Department engages with some of the governments, that they create a kind of a hybrid engagement where they at least hear out the diaspora and assimilate some of their ideas in the missions that they execute over there. And then when it comes down to some of the root causes and abiding causes of Boko Haram, you now find also that there's a tremendous need to evaluate the way the Nigerian government treats its youth or appraises what it does for its youth, because the bulk of Boko Haram are basically folks who don't have any skills, any training. They're basically hanging out, and they're young, and they are very vulnerable to recruitment. And so ultimately, the education and training that needs to be enhanced doesn't necessarily have to be academic education, probably more on the blue-collar scale, in order to be able to create a kind of an underclass economy and folks who will actually go out there and have a reason to wake up every day. And I'm going to leave it at that for now until we get more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. we come to what I know is the heart of the program, which is questions from the audience. You will note that there are two mics in the far corridors. If you will please line up behind them. Before we get to the questions right away, at the beginning of the program, some members of the African Diplomatic Corps who are here with us were acknowledged, but I'm going to acknowledge them again. We have here with us the ambassadors from Namibia, from Mali, from Ghana, from Mozambique, from Senegal, and from Niger. Excellencies, if you will please stand up. We will take the first question from the ambassador from Mali.
Yeah, good morning. I first want to thank Honorable Karen Bass and Wilson and Nick for organizing this meeting today. We're talking about Boko Haram and its regional impact. The regional impact of Boko Haram is not only on the Chad Basin region, it's all over Africa. It is in my country. As you all know, the north of Mali has been occupied by the jihadists in the second part of the year 2012. And among the terrorist groups that were there was Boko Haram. And what they did is not only destroy the mausoleums, they also killed people very cruelly, just like Madame Wilson has told us, more cruel than that. In the north of Mali was Boko Haram, was also Ansar Din, was Al-Shabaab, was ACMI, or Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. What I want the audience to know is that they are all together and they have a very well thought of strategy. And their strategy is to create insecurity. Their strategy is to occupy the situation. Their strategy is to recruit the youth. Under the Assistant Secretary Linda has said that if you have the youth without economic opportunity, then they get vulnerable. And it is because of that now in the news every other day you would hear that young people from France, young people from Senegal, young people from Mali, from Morocco has been recruited by Islamic State. So Islamic State, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ACMI, Ansar Din, they are all together. And I think the world needs to also have a comprehensive strategy to fight them. In my country, we have our strategy, of course, and we are grateful to the international community in helping us implement it. We are grateful to the leadership of the United States. The President Barack Obama has decided in August of 2014 the Security Governance Initiative, and Mali is one of the 5 countries in that, and there are many American servicemen in Mali today helping us, but we need much, much, much more. Besides Mali's strategy, we have a G5 Sahel, in which Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina, and Chad are 5 countries. G5 Sahel has its strategy. African Union has its strategy. Of course, the United Nations have their strategy, but what I mean is that we need more resources to fight against the terrorism, I just came from Bamako a few days ago. I have to stop. Yeah, okay, I will stop. A few days ago, and well, the instruction that I have received from the president of Mali is that I should insist that we need more help in the fight against terrorism. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Ambassador Brigeti, you mentioned that 10 years earlier,
Right.
the African interest in fighting terrorism was not as much. Could you take just a minute to react to what the ambassador from Mali said?
I will, and I'll take just a moment. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your comments, and of course, our condolences for the recent attacks in Bamako. You're absolutely right about the resurgence of Ansar al-Din in the north of your country, and that the terrorism problem is across the Sahel, and not only in the Lake Chad Basin and Boko Haram, with Boko Haram. What I would say is that what concerns me as a foreign policy person based in the United States looking at the global counterterrorism problem is that in the American context, our electorate has been seized with the problem of Daesh, of ISIS, and outside of the pockets of a few people, most of whom are represented in this room are people like you, the broader American electorate is basically ignorant about the challenge of terrorism in Africa and its relation to the broader problem of global terrorism. And that has to change, because it is vitally important that the entirety of our country, as well as those of our allies, recognize that this is a truly global problem, not simply in the streets of Paris, not simply on the streets of Baghdad, not simply on the streets of Damascus, but also other places, so that we can have an appropriately framed long-term response that has, as Dr. Gilpin said, all the appropriate components of the military and intelligence component, but also the importance of creating jobs for young people, as well as to create the governance structures that give people alternatives besides simply radicalization and the result of force to address their issues. And this, as I say, as the Assistant Secretary said, it's a long-term fight, decades.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to really thank Mrs. Linda Thomas Greenfield, Congresswoman Karen Bass, Congresswoman Wilson, and all the people in the United States and everywhere who are really keeping the issue of not only Boko Haram, but violence in Africa as really a fundamental issue to put on the table when we're talking about Africa. You cannot have democracy. You cannot have development. You cannot have moving forward if there is no peace. And this is very important. I would like to echo what my colleague from Mali said. We have all the policies, but we have to really agree with Dr. Gilpin. We have to look at really deep-rooted causes of Boko Haram and other violence. Deep poverty is dehumanizing. Deep poverty is dehumanizing. Deep ignorance is dehumanizing. When children, women, men wake up every day and they don't see the horizon, they can be subject to any type of movement, whether it's Boko Haram, whether it's Daesh, whether it's Isaac, any movement, because they have no other alternative. So we have to humanize people. Poverty is something that we should all say no. We have to be worried about the victim becoming victimizer. In Africa, when I see women, some, yes, are forced to wear the belt and go bomb others and kill themselves. But some are there to the very ideas that Boko Haram, ISIS, etc. are promoting. What do we do with that? And again, we are seeing the rise of women kamikaze. I think when African women become someone who really wears the belt, kill herself, her child, etc., I think there is something fundamentally more complex than Boko Haram is Islam or not Islam. I think we need to really accept that, yes, we need to approach the issue from a militaristic perspective because you have to decapitate, as they said, but we have to look at it also from socio-economic and socio-political route. We need to have, along with the security, the counter-terrorist package, we need to have consistent long-term development package which comes with the strategy. If we don't have education, we don't have food, we don't have socio-economic, we don't empower communities, they are going to fall prey to Boko Haram. So I would like to thank you for that.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. We will now go to questions. Please note that the model for the two ambassadors is not the model for the people behind this. So please keep your questions very short. If you look behind you, you will see that there is a long line. We would like to accommodate as many as possible, and I'm going to take 5. We'll start over here from this line and alternate, and also I'll take the first 3 here and the first 2 over there, and then turn them over. Please also make it a short question directed to a particular panelist. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carl Levan from American University. I published a book on Nigeria last year, and I left a great job on Capitol Hill 16 years ago to start working in and on Nigeria. And one comment I have, and this builds to a question, is for Ambassador Brigady, and that is, 2006, 2007 was a very different kind of turning point, I think, for those of us who follow Nigeria, which is none of us had any hope about the hostages that were being taken daily in the Niger Delta. And there are some important differences between that conflict and the one unfolding today, but that sense of hopelessness at that time cannot be understated either here or in Nigeria at that time. The other comment I had is for Dr. Gilpin, and this leads to the policy-oriented question about what to do in Washington, and that is the other element of Plan Columbia's quote-unquote success was massive cooperation with NGOs, including the human rights community here in Washington, D.C., who worked very closely inside the interagency teams in Colombia in order to build trust on the ground and to make sure that America's allies were effective and accountable and so forth. And what can we do on the U.S. side to ensure that the NGO community and Nigerian civil society can get into the North? Because as it is right now, they're almost completely locked out. Even the humanitarian community is having a very difficult time getting up to some of the areas that they need to be reached. And I just met with some of the humanitarian community here in Washington yesterday, and they're very concerned about this.
Thank you, Carl. We'll go over to this side. Please keep it short.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ni. My name is Yalengi Ngemi. I'm the director of Congo Coalition, also a writer with Huffington Post. I want to thank Congresswoman Bass, and I've been following you. I just wanted to ask a question, but first I want to say that...
Please keep it to the question, please.
Yes. Okay. The question is, while we're talking about Boko Haram, Congresswoman Bass, do we know, or did you know, that right now in the Congo, that not only Al-Shabaab, but Boko Haram and many other groups are recruiting children by giving $10 to each family so that they can give them children to put them in these schools they have and then send them overseas for training? Because that's what is happening right now in the Congo. And if the Congo, as big as it is, goes to these extremists, can you imagine where America will get its strategic minerals?
Thank you.
So that's something for us to meditate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Florinda Chevaucourt from Friends of Angola. My question can for Mr. Sam and Mr. Ambassador Rubin as well. I was just wondering, so we know that there is a deep corruption issue in other places in Africa, including where I come from in Angola, where you have, people stealing money every single day and people starving. I was just wondering how are you going to tackle those issues of corruption and human rights? Because it seems to me it's really feeling this issue of recruiting as well. So that would be my question.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Connie Sarajai. I have two questions. The first
One, please. One.
Okay, sorry. So for the general panel, I think this question is more important. What are some tangible things we can do as citizens here? And I'm a citizen of Nigeria as well, so I want to know, if I go back home, what is the tangible thing we can do that would actually affect the impact of Boko Haram?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Morning, my name is Omalola Deleosho with Actor Accountability, and my question goes to the panel as well. One of the challenges of really understanding the impact of Boko Haram has been access to information. For journalists as well as for humanitarian groups, as Dr. Levan just mentioned, what are some possibilities or tangible things that should be addressed or should be brought up to make sure that there is free access to information so that any strategic plans or proposals will actually be effective in the region?
Thank you.
Sure, I'll take the corruption issue, which actually applies to a couple of different questions. And now that I'm out of government, I can say these kinds of things. With all great respect to my brothers and sisters from Nigeria, the corruption issue was a major driver in the failure to take on Boko Haram earlier. If for no other reason, when you have the mighty Nigerian military, which used to be the greatest military in West Africa, that literally could not find ammunition or helmets or weapons to take to the fight in Nigeria because the treasury and the budget for the Ministry of Defense had been completely raided by corruption. And it's a fact, and one has to acknowledge that. And it goes to the question of the young lady about what average citizens can do, and also to the gentleman from Angola. Let me just wrap this up in an anecdote. One of my last acts as ambassador to the African Union, I had the high honor of helping to organize a visit of President Obama in his historic visit and speech to the African Union. And it is my view that the quality of the president's speech will have a resonance for a generation of young Africans, the same as President Kennedy's speech in Berlin did for a generation of young Europeans. And the president deeply challenged the audience, the people of Africa, to demand good governance, to demand accountability, to demand democracy, and demand an end to corruption across the continent, because at the end of the day, the only people that can end corruption in Africa are Africans themselves. Donors can't do it, the West can't do it, Now here is, and again, something else I can say since I'm out of government. Let me sort of tell you a little bit about the dynamic in the room. When the president started to talk about the importance of ending corruption, the importance of good governance, the level of applause on the floor from members of the diplomatic corps was polite. But the applause in the rafters from the citizens was rapturous. And that tells you something about the future of this continent. And it goes back to the fundamental question this young lady asked. Power concedes nothing that is not demanded of it. And African citizens have to demand and take the courage and take the hard steps to get the governance they deserve and they want, because no one else will do it for them. And once that happens, then the future of the continent will be bright.
Can you address the issue of the recruitment in the DRC?
I wish I could.
Well, you
But
any aspect of the other.
I'll speak very briefly on that, but let me just echo what Ambassador Brigty has just said about corruption. And I'm a little more skeptical, having followed the political economy of Africa very closely and directly since the 1970s. And I can tell you in the 1970s, I remember the very first then with the Organization of African Unity meeting that Mugabe attended in 1980, a similar dynamic played out, where there was a lot of optimism, etc., and there was popular call for, end of corruption, the youth taking. Well, the youth are in charge now, and the point I want to make is that the other thing that Africa needs to demand, and Africans need to demand, are strong institutions, viable institutions. The individuals who will be corrupt by nature. But if you have institutions that demand that they do the right thing and sanction wrong things, then we'll start seeing progress. But let me just make two quick, there's a point about Plan Colombia and the building of trust. It is very important. NGOs not in the north of Nigeria, there are many NGOs working in the north of Nigeria. I know of a coalition called Like Minds. They go up to Maiduguri, they go up to Yobe every weekend. We need to be able to identify those people. We need to be able to support them. And we also need to be able to ensure that there's space for them to do what needs to be done. What could we do? And here's where, Ambassador Brigty is out of government, so he can speak freely. I've never been in government, so I'm speaking freely anyway. Let's think about the multinational task force that's been put together. It's done a great job. The budget for the MNTF is supposed to be 700 million. Pledges so far, 250 million. About a third. And of that 250 million, 110 million was pledged by Nigeria when oil prices were a lot higher than they are now. So when you look at the mandate of the MNTF, the mandate of the MNTF is to stop it from spreading from Nigeria. Not robust like AMISOM, not complementary like AFISMA, but to just stop it from. So we have to take a hard look at what is around and make some honest choices. And one honest choice would be to ensure that we have a force that could deliver this kind of security, that could ensure that citizens are prioritized and human rights are respected, that could work not just across the governments, but with civilian joint task forces, with NGOs, etc. Thanks.
Sami Bunu, I want you to look at two pieces of two questions. Actually, the one on corruption had your name attached to it.
Corruption and human rights.
Yes.
And human rights.
Right.
I'd love to take
So I would like you to address that, but let me throw in this. I lived in Nigeria too. During the last elections, when the issue of corruption was President Jonathan was being strangled with the issue of corruption. I told a friend of mine, who in fact is in this room, there's been corruption in Nigeria before President Jonathan was born, before Boko Haram arose. So take a look at that. But also, it struck me what the Assistant Secretary said. I mean, I've been around Washington a long time. I've never heard a State Department official say, come and demonstrate, because we don't see demonstrations enough. Come and pressure us. As a leader of a diaspora NGO, address that also, because the young lady asked what we in the diaspora and our citizens can do. So corruption and NGOs.
All right, thank you. If you don't mind, I'd also like to touch a little bit on the human rights issue also. The facts of the corruption situation is definitely one of the greatest concerns that we as folks who grew up in that environment and make a living here find mind-boggling, especially when we see the kind of numbers that are being thrown around. And so it is a very serious problem, and it's a problem that perhaps has metamorphosed and gotten worse through the years, because I believe that the people who run things in Nigeria, the top government officials, have this sense of impunity anytime they get into power. And at some point, the power at their disposal and the resources at their disposal begin to sort of lose their essence to them. When we think about a situation where somebody in a sensitive role, like a national security advisor, will divvy up $2.1 billion, not $2.1 billion of a local currency, in dollars, among political associates, 100 million here, 50 million here, 200 million here, you start to think these people have lost all sense of decency and sense of value for the actual resources, because the cost of living is not really very high in Nigeria. People could have a decent life, on maybe $50,000 a year. But the thing that one man will divvy up hundreds of millions of dollars, what are they going to do? You buy a bunch of SUVs, buy mansions in Abuja and Lagos and Washington and New York, and you still have plenty left. So it doesn't make sense. But that's why we think that when the United States engages with Nigeria and other places in Africa where these things exist, they should directly or indirectly carry the diaspora leadership along, because we realize that diplomats have to be nice when they go overseas. They're not going to look at some official in the face and say, you're crazy. You're moving around that kind of money. What are you going to do with it? But the diaspora, the U.S. diaspora, can actually say things like that. We put things in the media. We talk to them straight. We can read their body language a lot better, because most of us have roots. We have lived there as little boys or as teenagers, but we understand the body language, and we can actually look them in the eyes and say, hey, you gotta be crazy to try something like this, because the ramification of corruptions is actually very direct. When you don't buy weapons for the troops and you're sending troops to battle, then obviously people are going to die. Troops are going to die. We've actually advocated that the charges that are being filed right now for the National Security Advisor and a bunch of his cohorts and political associates need to be revised